Okay, so welcome everybody. Good morning. This is Karen from Canadian Women's Foundation, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to this webinar today. Today we are going to be talking about the Global Compact on Migration, and we're happy that you've all been able to join us early this morning, especially those who are joining from Canada's West Coast. We don't typically offer webinars at this time of day, but this is a special exception because we have presenters located in New York, Spain, and Thailand, so we're straddling global time zones rather than just national ones. Before we get started, I'd like to call your attention to a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, on the right-hand panel of your GoToWebinar application, you'll find a box where you can type questions. Some of you have already found it and are putting questions in already, but please use this box if you have any questions that you'd like to ask the presenters, or if you're having any difficulties with the technology, which is something we've already encountered this morning on the presenter side. Throughout the webinar, I'm going to be collecting your questions, and I'll pose them to the speakers at the end of the session. And if there's anything that we're unable to cover, we'll make sure that the presenters get your questions via email after the fact. Secondly, in that panel, you'll see a section with handouts that you can download for your reference. What we have there is the PDF copies of the slides from today, as well as a handout that has a number of links to documents that are associated with the Global Compact on Migration, both Canadian statements that have been made through the process, as well as civil society interventions from both the Women in Migration Network and from the Global Coalition on Migration that might be of interest to you in the context of this conversation. And the third thing that you should know is that this session is being recorded, and we will share the recording with all the participants and those in our networks after the fact. It looks like I've got somebody asking about the handouts in the question box. It's on the right-hand panel of your GoTo platform. You should see a tab called Handouts, and you can open that up, and the handouts are there for download, but I'll also share it by email just in case folks can't find it. So I think I'll just shorten up my opening comments, since we're a bit of a late start this morning, and just launch into introducing our speakers for today. Today we're hearing from three global civil society leaders who have been following the Global Compact process since it began in 2016. And they also follow other global processes related to the governance of international migration, and they pay particular attention to the human rights concerns associated with intergovernmental agenda setting in this area. These three women are truly experts and have long histories of working with migrant communities, particularly migrant women, and they do a fantastic job of applying a feminist and intersectional lens to all the work that they do. Our panelists today are Monami Malik, who spent many years organizing migrants, particularly undocumented South Asian youth in New York City, before taking on the leadership of the Global Coalition on Migration. Carol Barton, who is also based in New York City and is a longtime advocate for both women's and migrants' rights, with years of experience working with faith-based communities. And Leah Sullivan, who's a new addition to the team at the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women based in Bangkok. And I'll invite each of these speakers to introduce themselves to you today, to say a little bit more about themselves and the organizations they work for when they launch into their presentations. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Monami to begin our discussion on the Global Compact. Thanks, Monami.
Great, thank you, Karen, and thank you for having me on the call. Apologies if you can't hear me too well, the internet is a little weak. I'm currently the international coordinator, as Karen mentioned, of the Global Coalition on Migration. And so I will be doing for you just an overview of what is this Global Compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration that governments will be negotiating and adopting in 2018. First, I'll tell you a little bit about the Global Coalition. We could have the next slide, Karen.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So the Global Coalition on Migration is, Karen, are you able to move the slides?
Sorry, I thought it had moved already.
Okay.
Let's see. Are folks not seeing it? It's still the title slide?
No, we're
Okay.
still on the page.
All right, let's see. Sorry, folks. Can you see it now?
No. You see the introduction slide, the first slide.
Yeah, there we are.
Got it now?
There
okay.
we go. Yep, thank you, Karen.
You're welcome.
So the Global Coalition on Migration is a coalition, a network of organizations and networks in every region. So we have migrant networks in Asia, in Africa, Latin America, North America, Europe, and through colleagues of ours in the Middle East as well. We also have the International Trade Union Council as part of the coalition, FACE networks, and academics and researchers. And the Global Coalition really works to coordinate a unified strategy that's rooted in human rights of migrants, as well as the leadership of migrant organizing networks ourselves, to be able to lift up the work we do in the regions and nationally on migration, but also to be able to advocate together around global migrant rights policies. And to that extent, in the last year, we've really been building the capacity of migrant networks across different countries and regions to be able to impact the global compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration. Next slide. So what is the Global Compact on Safe, Regular, and Orderly Migration? Last year, in September of 2016, governments across the world came together during the General Assembly of the United Nations and held a high-level summit on addressing large movements of refugees and migrants. This was on September 19th, and you'll see on the screen a link to the outcomes of the summit and information on the summit. The summit was prompted by what we've all seen in the media, the images of the many migrant deaths and struggles crossing the Mediterranean, the crisis in Syria, as well as migrant flows from Africa and North Africa into Europe. And while it was the attention of this publicly that really prompted governments to take action and hold this summit, what many of us know in migrant rights work is that this crisis, particularly deaths in the Mediterranean, deaths at borders, and in general, sort of large-scale movement of people and inadequate protection of rights for people is something that has been going on actually for quite a number of years. What did come out of the summit last year was the New York Declaration, which governments signed on to at the summit. And what the New York Declaration does is that it sets out sort of responsibilities for governments, commitments of governments, which apply to both refugees and migrants, a particular set of commitments which apply to migrants, and a particular set of commitments for refugees. And this New York Declaration became the groundwork for laying out two processes that are taking place now. We could have the next slide. So what the declaration does is that it sets out that in the next about 2 years, on the one hand, governments would be working on what's called a global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration, and on the other hand, a global compact on responsibility sharing on refugees. And so this process embarked really in 2017, whereby a series of consultations have begun. And the first set, it's really the Compact on Migration that's launched sort of gotten off the ground a lot further in terms of the process and development, whereas the Compact on Refugees has been a little bit slower, but actually just began with its first set of consultations. With the Migration Compact, we're at this point about halfway through the consultations, and I'll explain those to you from the next slide. Karen, are you able to pull up the next slide?
Yeah. Is this the one you're looking for?
The one I see, the one after this, I think.
The one with the phases on it? Or no, next one?
Yes, the one with the phases on it.
Okay. That's what I think I'm displaying. Sorry, folks.
That's okay. It's not the one I'm seeing. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
It may just be a little slow. That's all. Maybe the connection. It might be on my end. Sorry about that. So the slide I can see right now that we have up is what is the Global Compact. So the Global Compact is set out to be an intergovernmental negotiated document that would deal with all aspects of migration that were laid out in the New York Declaration, and that includes 20 different areas of migration policy. The compact would have contributions from civil society, scientific and knowledge-based institutions, parliaments, local authorities, private sector, and migrants themselves. However, it's also quite clear that this is an intergovernmental process, and there are many ways in which civil society, we have to actively, really actively advocate for inclusion in the process. The compact is also not something that would make new law. Governments are negotiating this at a time where the background and the rhetoric is quite a unfriendly one, where xenophobia and sort of anti-migrant sentiment has taken hold in a lot of different national contexts, where nationalist parties have really created anti-immigrant rhetoric and climates around elections and political issues. And so because this is the backdrop, governments have been pretty clear that this is going to be a non-binding agreement, and would really set out more so what would be voluntary principles and guidelines with actionable and practical commitments. A lot of discussion is that the compact would be modeled after the Sustainable Development Goals, where it would lay out sort of goals, targets, and indicators that have a great graduated timeline of implementation. Could we have the next slide?
Okay, the one that's displaying now is the one with the phases.
Okay, great. I will, okay, I'll use another set of slides because my connection is slow. But okay, so the phases of the process are, right now we are in phase one, which are called thematic consultations, which will last from April through November of this year. The fourth thematic consultation is about to take place next week, and in a minute I'll review the topics of those consultations. The thematic consultations phase is meant to be a phase of primarily education and information sharing, analysis sharing about the different aspects of migration. The next phase after this is what's called stock taking. Between December of 2017 and February of next year, which will begin with an intergovernmental conference in Guadalajara, Mexico, where all of the outputs and recommendations from the various phases will be compiled together, and governments will begin drafting what would be considered a zero draft of the compact document itself. That zero draft would then be taken into phase three, which are negotiations of the compact from February through July of 2018. Phase three of negotiations would all happen at the UN headquarters in New York. And finally, the goal was to have, in September 2018, during the UN General Assembly in New York, to have the compact be adopted by all member states attending the General Assembly. However, more recently, we've heard that this may not happen as soon as September of 2018, but that an international conference on migration might take place in the last months of 2018, sometime between October and December. Could I have the next slide?
6 thematic consultations.
Yes. So the 6 thematic consultations are laid out here. The first one launched with focus on the human rights of migrants, social inclusion, racism and xenophobia in Geneva. The second one addressed drivers of migration, so root causes including climate change, development and poverty, as well as conflict. The third thematic focused on international cooperation and governance, which is an increasingly area of concern, given that there's a lack of clarity in whether migration would come back into the UN system fully, and also the role of the IOM, International Organization of Migration, as a lead agency and now a related agency within the UN system. The fourth thematic consultation, as I mentioned, will take place next week in New York on contributions of migrants and diaspora. The fifth will focus on smuggling of migrants and trafficking, which has become a central political element in the compact, and Leah will describe a bit more later. And the last thematic is on irregular migration and regular pathways. In addition to this, the next slide, Karen.
Yep, go ahead.
Great. So in addition to this, there are quite a few regional and national consultations as well. At first, we had heard that there would be approximately 70 national multi-stakeholder consultations. However, this number seems to be a lot less now. And later on in the call, we'll talk about the possibility of one to take place in Canada. In addition to the national consultations, there are 6 regional civil society consultations, and this is really the primary space that civil society and migrant rights networks can come into the compact and have some influence. The civil society regional consultations are aligned with the regional economic commission meetings. Some will take place prior to those meetings, some afterwards. But they are being supported through funding that was pulled together by the International Organization for Migration. However, the IOM has been sort of increasingly clear over the last few days in Geneva that they will hold no political direction or leadership over the civil society consultations, that these are completely independent civil society-led processes anchored by networks and organizations in each of the regions. So the first regional consultation will begin in Asia in a week or two on August 3rd and 4th in Bangkok, hosted by Migrant Forum in Asia, and a number of other Asian regional organizations on the committee for that, including the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women. The second regional will take place in the Middle East, North Africa region at the end of August in Beirut. The third to take place in Africa, actually it will not be in Addis Ababa, but it will be in Bamako, hosted by the Pan-African Network in Defense of Migrant Rights and Made Africa. The next one would be in North America towards the end of September in Washington, D.C., hosted by a steering committee of a number of organizations, including the Women in Migration Network and others. And finally, the last two would take place in Latin America and in Europe. The Latin American one will be in Quito sometime in early October, and Europe will take place in Brussels in early October. Next slide.
Okay, go ahead.
So I just want to close up with talking about some of the key issues in the compact and what those key issues are and this is coming from discussions from the Global Coalition on Migration and our partners on the ground, that we really would like to see a compact that does not further criminalize migrants or criminalize irregular entry, but one that actually creates more channels and paths so that people can migrate regularly and safely. We also want to see the end of detention of migrants in the compact. However, this is a very contentious issue where even the detention of children was greatly contested by certain governments last year during the negotiations for the New York Declaration, where certain governments would not agree to even language that is in international standards right now that says that detention of children is never in the best interest of the child. So what we're concerned about from different sectors of civil society is that the compact may actually take us backwards in terms of international human rights standards in various conventions that hold currently for migrants. A third area that we'd like to focus on is firewalls so that irregular migrants can safely access services. The next slide.
Okay.
Another area that we're advocating for is access to justice for all migrants, regardless of status, respecting the rights of irregular migrants at work, ensuring gender aspects of migration and rights for migrant women are something that are addressed across the compact. And lastly, as I mentioned before, really advocating for different models or channels of paths of regular migration that don't rely solely on temporary labor migration. But just to say, as I mentioned before, because the negotiation language, the mindset of governments, the driving force being Western global North governments that are destination countries and wealthier and hold more power within the UN system, the starting place of discussions and negotiations is one that is alarming in some ways and not one that really centers the rights of migrants. And so there's a lot of pushback from governments currently even about acknowledging the rights of irregular or undocumented migrants, even though this is committed to in the New York Declaration. There is also a lot of central focus on returns or deportations of migrants, readmission and reintegration. And it seems like the strategy, as many of us know, even in national advocacy on immigration reform, is that the strategy of governments is to say that first we will gain public confidence by securing our borders, closing off borders, making sure that those within the country who do not qualify for asylum or have failed asylum claims are returned safely. And then that will lay the ground with greater public confidence to create more regular paths and possibly reforms for immigration in the future. And so many of us see this as a dangerous trade-off, and this has become sort of a central element in thinking about what the future of the compact will be and what our advocacy needs to be. Next slide.
Okay.
So I'll just end off by, in this piece of the presentation, by saying some of the resources that you could find, you may find useful is our Global Coalition's frequently asked questions on the compact, the issue brief we've developed for the first consultation on human rights, and then an issue brief on the key issues within the compact. Our website is also listed here, and we regularly update resources there. The official UN page is refugeesmigrants.un.org, which has developments and output documents from all the consultations. And finally, IOM's Global Compact site with updated information. So I'll pause there, and thank you.
Sorry, Monami, I'm just going to interject because the slide that we're looking at now is the one about what Canada has been saying and Canada's key positions.
Okay.
Do you have that version, or do you need me to walk it through?
I can see it, actually. Yeah,
oh, you
so
can?
I'll
okay,
go
great.
ahead and, sure. So I'll go ahead and do this. So I was combing through, I was able to attend the first few consultations and speak at the first one on human rights. And so I was compiling, keeping track of what the Canadian government has been saying. And just to preface this by saying that it's a little bit unclear in terms of who's actually from a national government, who is actually intervening and who are the focal points on the compact. So for instance, there are a set of actors who are based in the missions in Geneva who participate in the consultations that happen in Geneva from governments, and there's often a different set of actors from missions in New York that participate in the consultations there. And then sometimes in different thematic sessions, representatives are actually sent from national capitals to the consultations. So even within a government's position, sometimes it can be different from one moment to the next, depending on who and their level of expertise on migration and the compact. But some of the things I had heard from the Canadian government representatives is a real emphasis around gender responsive policies, and particularly looking at how migration can be economically empowering for women, and really in a positive way talking about enforcing labor standards for migrant women workers. The Canadian representatives also address right to education regardless of status, measures to protect the human rights of vulnerable migrants, and a particular, and this has been a topic of conversation, but a particular proposal from the Canadian government has been training for border authorities on treating migrants with respect and protecting their rights. During the second thematic consultation on drivers, the Canadian representatives had talked about human mobility as being a positive force for development, supporting interregional mobility agreements and building greater capacity for regional, sub-regional bodies. While this sounds very important on the face of it, this may also be driven by what a lot of Western governments are focusing on now, which is to sort of deter migration to reach their borders. And so it's called border externalization in its, I think in its most alarming sense, to really promote more sort of the stopping of migration before reaching the shores of North America and Europe can mean greater mobility within regions, but it could basically be also with passing off responsibility in regions in Northern Africa and the Middle East that are already really doing more than their share in hosting migrants and refugees. Next slide.
Okay.
Positions have been about supporting the need for more civil society engagement. So the Canadian government has really been an ally on this front. Promoting national action plans to measure progress. So they want a document that's really concrete with commitments and measurement and accountability. However, Canada is also seen as a model globally on temporary labor migration programs. And so the Canadian government has really been advocating what's called global skills partnerships through bilateral agreements. Global skills partnerships are agreements where there is joint pre-training of those who are potential migrants by Canadian, I think through funding from the Canadian, possibly Canadian government, but largely from the private sector, to say, for example, if there's a shortage of nurses in Canada, that there would be training of perhaps women in the Philippines who are potential migrants, and to meet the needs of the Canadian labor market. And then those trained sort of migrants would be brought into Canada through a temporary circular visa program. So this is something that's gained a lot of traction, and Canada is seen as a good model. And then, of course, I think there are also various critiques of this, particularly from trade unions and labor sectors in Canada and elsewhere. And then lastly, I'll say Ahmed Hussein, who's the Minister of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship, just spoke 2 days ago at the IOM International Dialogue on Migration on a panel that I was on, and really addressed the Model Global Skills Partnership Program again. However, right now there's no discussion about a national consultation within Canada on the compact, but this is really open-ended. So if all of you on this call or others want to advocate for this, I think there's room to do that, and I'd be happy to work with you if that is the case to help make that happen. So thank you for listening in for this piece, and I'll turn it over to Karen.
Thank you so much, Monami. That was a really great overview. Now we're going to shift things over to Carol to talk about the gendered dimensions of the compact, and that will be followed by Leah, who's going to talk about the trafficking and smuggling thematic. And I just want to do a bit of a time check because we got started so late and had technical problems. We will continue till 10:15. So Carol and Leah will have about 10 minutes for their presentations and then hopefully some time for questions. And in the meantime, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the question box now so that they're ready to go. All right, and with that, I will turn things over to Carol.
Good morning to those of you in Canada, and good evening to Leah. This is Carol Barton, and I'm with the Women in Migration Network, and I want to note that Leah, GATW, and Monami are both also active in the in the Women in Migration Network. And we also convene organizations in all regions of the world to focus on the global policy arena in terms of women in migration. And we are also members of the Global Coalition on Migration. And just one quick note there, that we'll be present in all of the regional meetings that are taking place by civil society in preparation for the Global Compact to bring a gender perspective from the regional vantage point. Next slide. So we use the frame of women in migration instead of migrant women. And that's a concept that's evolved as we talk with other sisters and colleagues around the world in recognizing that women who stay behind in the Philippines, in Mexico, those are some of the places that talked to us and said, we're part of the migration story as well. When the men in our families migrate and we're left to sustain families, we're very much involved in the migration story. So we speak about women still at home, women in transit, women who themselves or with their families migrate, as well as women who are returned or deported and in a new situation. So it's the whole continuum. And we emphasize that because the UN, if it speaks at all about women, it speaks about migrant women. And it tends to want to box women only into the category of domestic workers or trafficked women and not see the full spectrum of women. And there are many, many women who are migrating on their own as migrant workers, as well as with their families who are intrinsic to the migration context. We do feel that it's really important to focus on root causes, and the women in migration model helps us to do that because if we expand it more, we understand that women who are not even thinking about migrating but resisting displacement in their countries are also ultimately part of the migration story because if they're displaced by land grabs, by violence, by war, they become migrants as well. And then an important note that we always use an intersectional lens, and simply that there isn't a generic woman, that migrants have multiple identities of race, sexual orientation, religion, et cetera, that also exacerbate the struggles that they may face. Next slide. I won't go into great detail here, but we bring a gender analysis that isn't just about women and girls per se, but about gendered roles that society has assigned historically to certain genders. So that if women are assigned by society to be the caregivers, particularly in terms of unpaid work, and the ones who are disproportionately rearing children, doing elder care, that impacts the context in which they migrate. Often they may migrate alone in order to send money back to the elders and the children and the family, or they may be bringing children in tow with them if they migrate, or they may be the ones left behind with children and families when others migrate, because that's a role that has been too often assigned by society. So the role of women's unpaid labor plays a pretty critical role. And I think one of the things we underscore is that really the big picture here, the big story that Mon Ami alluded to quite well, is that what we have is a global economy that wants cheap labor and wants labor to move at its beck and call to meet the needs, but then to dispose of that labor when it's not needed. And that's being in the UN system, that's called circular migration. And it's one that has really been modeled by the Canadian government, as Mon Ami said. And it's the idea, we'll bring you as a skilled nurse, we'll bring you as a domestic worker, tied to a certain employer for a certain amount of time, and you can send your remittances home, which the countries at home are very happy to have. And then but you can't bring your family, you can't stay long term, you can't be on a path to residency and permanent status, and then you go home when that labor is no longer needed. At the same time, we have a global system that has been wringing resources out of countries of the global south, and so people are in economies where they're forced to leave. There's rising conflicts over resources where they're forced to move, and when they do move, they're labeled irregular migrants and criminalized. So this compact seems to be seeking to legitimize this circular migration model and to streamline it and make it more efficient and effective, as well as to further criminalize those who come in irregular status outside of that model, and to codify that in a new way, which I think is directly relevant to civil society in Canada, both as a country that has really modeled this circular migration and one that is also dealing with large numbers of irregular migrants that face criminalization. So I think in a nutshell, the importance of being involved in this global compact is because it's going to impact policy in Canada and the way that migrants are treated in Canada as well as at a global level. Next slide. Just very quickly, I won't go through all of this, but one of the things that we hear the most in the UN is that women are categorized in a box as an add-on, as these vulnerable populations that must be saved and rescued. So one of the primary things that Women in Migration is saying is that women in migration are not vulnerable and in need of rescue. They are advocates for their rights. And it's the immigration policies that create inequality and put migrant women or women in migration in a situation of vulnerability. And this is particularly dangerous because there are countries, particularly, for example, in terms of labor migration in Asia, that actually are creating laws to protect women who migrate, but what they're doing is forcing them outside of regular channels of migration and actually making them, putting them in more vulnerable situations. For example, you can't migrate if you're under 35. You can't migrate if you have a child under 5 years old. But when people feel that they're forced to migrate for economic reasons, they're going to find a way. But then they do it through middlemen and through very dangerous channels. So this notion of protecting migrant women is one that we're trying to debunk in every way. An add-on to that is that the concept of protection of women is also used sometimes to criminalize migrant men, and that takes on a racist and xenophobic element. We've put out a statement, for example, after the couple of years ago in New Year's Eve, there was in Cologne, Germany, some white German women were attacked by brown North African men, and many of them were actually citizens of Germany, but they were labeled migrant men, and that was used as an excuse to further criminalize flows of new refugees and migrants to Germany in the name of protecting womanhood. So we also have a clear perspective that a protection of women, issues of violence against women are not particular to a region or group of people or race or ethnicity. It's generic, and that can't be an excuse for further criminalization. Next. some of this we've already said, so I won't go through all of it, but some of the really critical issues beyond what I've already mentioned is family unity. And so the whole circular migration model undermines that because it allows only single people to migrate as workers, but without their families, and aren't allowed to bring their families together. Also, something we're seeing in the US now, I'm not sure how much you're seeing it in Canada yet, but literally raids by immigration enforcement, pulling people out of their homes, away from their children, and deporting them separate from their families. So family unity is an essential one for us. Issues around gender-based violence, including state violence, because we have documented a lot of violence in detention, violence by bosses when women are tied to one boss, that is part of the migration story. Monami mentioned, and I'll just echo the fact that international law says that migrants are bearers of rights regardless of status, but that is undermined at every turn by governments. And so we're affirming that migrant women and their families need access to services, decent work, and the criminal justice system regardless of status. Clearly, the issues of labor rights is a central one in terms of hyper-exploitation and additional levels of exploitation that women workers face as migrant women that need to be addressed. And we feel that that has to happen in terms of challenging the circular migration itself. Leah will speak to trafficking. The last one I mentioned is, I think, a stretch when we're talking about international migration. Certainly for the member states it is. But we also think that the criminalization and killing of women's human rights defenders in countries of origin is an essential conversation that needs to have in terms of root causes. I think of the case, for example, of Berta Cáceres, the Lenca indigenous woman in Honduras, who was resisting a dam that would displace her community and was murdered. And it looks like, from evidence, that there was some role of the state in that. So that is not about a migrant woman, but about somebody who is doing the work of the SDGs, of sustainable development in their own country, and is murdered as a result. So I think that we need to also think about how Canadian cooperation, or in my case in the US cooperation, may be either supporting those leaders or undermining those leaders, and ultimately creating forced migration. Next and last slide, because I need to move on. Recommendations, I think I'll leave to you all, and they echo quite a bit what Monami has said. But there's some very specific things to women. For example, women often move with visas and papers connected to a spouse or connected to a boss, and that makes them extremely vulnerable to gender-based violence. And so we're urging that women be able to move autonomously, and that their children gain the nationality of their mother, because often children become stateless in places where they don't have that right. I just want to move to what Canadian groups can do to wrap up. I think that it's really important to look at the current gendered realities of women in migration in Canada, and to help make them visible. If you all are in women's organizations, we see our role as helping to put migration on the agenda of women's migrations and to see the realities of migrant women. One of the things that's really important to understand is that if Canada has made great gains on the rights of women and gender equality in law, those do not extend to undocumented migrant women unless there's explicit effort to do that in local and national law. So it's an additional step that has to happen to make sure that, for example, laws around violence against women extend to women in an irregular status, and if they report that violence, they aren't going to be turned over to migration authorities and deported. So it's a really important task for women's organizations to take that on. And certainly for migrant rights organizations, I think it's going to be important to point out the gaps between the rhetoric and lived realities of the Canadian government. Canada is doing and saying some really excellent things around welcoming refugees, and yet the circular migration model continues to undermine rights of migrant workers. So get involved at the national level. Learn more about the position of your government. See if you can meet with Canadian government officials who are working on this, and link migration to other concerns that you may be working on. It may not be the sole focus of your work, but if you're working in other arenas, migration is going to come up in labor, it's going to come up in gender, it's going to come up in community organizing, or any of the areas that you might be working in. So I think with that, there's another slide that references some documents, and I will pass it over to Leah.
Great. Thank you very much, Carol. And Leah, take it away.
Hi, everyone. This is Leah from GATW. Can I be heard? Let's hope so.
You're good.
I'm going to be talking about trafficking and smuggling in the context of the Global Compact on Migration. First, I'm going to introduce GATW a little bit. GATW was formed in 1994 by a group of women activists who initially brought out the issue of trafficking within the framework of women's migration. Our starting point was to see why women left home for work, whether that work was recognized, and what happens along the way. And now we're an alliance of 84 NGO members across the world. Our work has always centered on the voices and experience of migrant women and returnee migrants. We are a member of Women on Migration Network, and similar to them, it's important for us to look at women as decision makers, women with agency, and women who have the ability to resist abuse and determine their future. And if we go to, on the correct slide now. So we're just to sort of talk about our approach to migration and trafficking is that since 2007 we had a study called Collateral Damage, which looked at the negative impacts of the anti-trafficking framework. We really realized we needed to be able to see how migration policies, work situations, and gender norms are affecting trafficked people. And the trafficking and migration relationship has sort of a two-way street. So anti-trafficking negatively affects migrants in that it contributes to the stigmatization of migrants, the restriction of women's movements, especially to be protective, and migration management can also negatively affect trafficked persons by tightening border limits, which limits people's opportunities for regular migration, and then when they rely on brokers and third parties, they end up having to who can be traffickers, they end up paying higher prices. There's also a number of sort of strategic advantages to talking about trafficking from a migration perspective, and it's that focusing on all migrants' rights moves the focus away from anti-trafficking away from a crime focus that defines much of state policy on anti-trafficking. It emphasizes that people have the right to freedom of movement. Anti-trafficking programs and legislation sometimes violate this right. It shifts what can be an over-focus on trafficking for sexual exploitation to examine other sectors. And finally, language around migration shows stronger, empowered migrants than does trafficking language. Migrants are not usually seen as victims, but as people determined to improve their lives, in contrast sometimes to trafficked persons. So moving on to trafficking, the next slide, which is trafficking and smuggling in the context of the Global Compact on Migration. As a network, we're looking at sort of what are the challenges and opportunities that this compact brings to talk about to improve the discourse and improve the implementation of existing legislation, not only the trafficking protocol, but also the entire range of human rights legislation that improves the rights of all people, including migrants. And so what we want to do is, in general, sort of ensure that measures at borders do not adversely affect the human rights of migrants. And we want to use that opportunity to open doors, to talk to governments and talk to regional processes. We also want to build up the understanding of the differences between trafficking and smuggling by articulating some of these and dispel some of the myths and misperceptions that people have with regard to trafficking and smuggling. So what are these myths? What are these trends, myths, and misperceptions? And if we can move on to the next slide, I'll talk about those that relate to trafficking. And in the 15 years since the implementation of the trafficking protocol, we can see that there are very clear discrepancies between how trafficking is understood in the public discourse, national legislations, and the internationally agreed legal meaning. This manifests itself in a number of negative ways, including the co-option of trafficking in persons by states as a justification for anti-migration initiatives, which is something we're seeing hints of already in the interventions that states are making in the thematic sessions for the Global Compact. Anti-trafficking policies are also being used to target migrant workers by raiding places of work. Obviously, this doesn't help trafficked persons, who can often be then returned alongside migrants, and then states are then avoiding their human rights obligations to trafficked persons. And under the trafficking protocol, which the vast majority of the UN states have ratified, that includes obligations to trafficked persons. As Carol's already pointed out, trafficking is a concept used to misrepresent women in migration as inherently vulnerable, positioning them as overwhelmingly as actual or potential victims of crime. And we also think, and I think Carol's emphasized this very well, is that as part of this global compact we can draw attention to the fact that there's little understanding or attention given to the fact that migrant women workers may be trafficked even in regular migration programs such as temporary or guest worker programs. So I think we need to use this opportunity of the global compact to talk about the problems with those particular programs. Another challenge that we're facing with regard to the Global Compact and trafficking is one of sort of data and perceptions, because we're being asked as part of this to talk about facts and figures and practical policy recommendations. We're hearing that a lot from governments. And with regard to trafficking, the data around trafficking is poor and it's minimal. And the problem with collecting numbers of people who are trafficked is that you only find what you're looking for. So while slowly UNODC, which is the part of the UN that collects data on trafficked persons, they're gradually finding proportionally more victims of labor trafficking versus trafficking for sexual exploitation, proportionally more men and boys compared to women and girls. There's still, the collection of this data is still in the context of state anti-trafficking efforts that remain very much focused on women as victims. And so this leads to a bias in the data. So that's something we're also looking to address as part of this. Moving on to smuggling, which is on the next slide. How do we address smuggling trends, myths, and misperceptions? And one of these is that, so the overriding sort of story about smuggling is that smuggling is a terrible thing inherently, and it's done by evil criminal networks, and we need to shut them down immediately. And we need to sort of unpack those assumptions about smuggling because they're not true large parts of the time. Because smuggling, when you see it through a human rights lens, it doesn't in itself constitute a human rights violation. It can be a relatively neutral provision of service that could enable a migrant to escape a situation of persecution or deprivation. Trafficking in persons, on the other hand, is always a human rights violation. But many migrants migrate with the aid of smugglers without any problems and are thankful for the help of those smugglers. I mean, with, of course, the smuggling doesn't impact women and men the same because there's a cost to smuggling. Financial or other material benefit is part of that definition, and women can be disadvantaged in having access to these routes as well because they typically have fewer resources. The way we need to call out states on the way they're responding to smuggling. The international law calls on states to criminalize smuggling, but what a lot of states are doing is criminalizing the smuggled, perhaps in addition to the smuggling more generally. And this restriction of regular migration channels and increasing the border security actually creates more opportunities for smuggling. So we're not sort of achieving what we want to with this. And the obligation of states to criminalize that smuggling then also aggravates circumstances that endanger migrants' lives. Another disturbing trend that we're seeing, and as something that I think we need to, as civil society, point out, is that some states have started to cite smuggling charges against civil society organizations and individuals who provide assistance to migrants, as we've seen in the Mediterranean. And that kind of action to save lives and protect the rights of people was intentionally not covered in the agreed definition of migrant smuggling, and that's something we need to bring home. And there's also sort of like a myth about who necessarily is a smuggler. There's something that a number of states and even UN agencies have been making reference to, the need to shut down these criminal networks. But actually even the UNODC in their own research has said that there's actually the available evidence, and this is in the context of Asia in any case, suggests that migrants are not routinely smuggled with other contraband, other drugs and weapons, and that assumptions about transnational mafia-style smuggling organizations are not supported by the available literature and data. That's from a UNODC document. And there's been other similar research in the Mediterranean to suggest the same. And while we want to emphasize these differences, it's also important to stress this one commonality, that migrants in the situation of smuggling are not criminals, just as trafficked persons are not. And that's contained in the Smuggling of Migrants Protocol. So I think I've gone at lightning speed and I'm nearly done, but just coming to quickly what civil society can do is that in line with, I think, the vision of everyone who's spoken today, civil society organizations, women's organizations, anti-trafficking organizations, labor organizations, and migrants organizations can all work together to on this, because migration is a phenomenon that affects so many people and so many different sectors. Getting involved in national and regional consultations is great. Again, putting pressure on IOM in Canada to hold one, given the Canadian government's stated commitment to the involvement of civil society. I think that should be a given. And the other thing to do is to sort of raise awareness in civil society organizations and demand better representation in these and other processes, because something that I'm noticing from being involved in these is that this is happening. Particularly the thematic consultations are happening at sort of a high level. There's a high cost associated with attending these, and it's really, we can't let this opportunity for engagement to pass, and I really think it's something that we need to do better, is have better migrant representation. And finally, that we need to not only push the particular legislation, but also all human rights and labor rights legislation across the board that does much to protect the rights of all people, including migrants. That was it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leah, and thank you to Carol and to Monami as well. I do have one question here from one of our attendees today that I will pose, and maybe this is something that Carol could speak to. Debbie was wondering about how you're within the women, the work of women, how you're applying a critical race analysis in addition to your gender analysis.
Thanks a lot for that question. And as I mentioned, we see that as central to the work that we do, that there is not a generic woman, and we're working through members in different regions, in different contexts, to unpack the reality, the lived reality of women who migrate, who are also experiencing other forms of oppression, be it race, ethnicity, religion, particularly Muslim women in Europe, for example, and what that means. And I think that that we've been clear as the Women in Migration Network that the discourse around migration is a raced discourse, that there are acceptable migrants and unacceptable migrants that, in terms of the discourse, that bear a high, without being explicit, a high level of exclusion of people of color, of Muslims, and other of indigenous people who are excluded to a greater rate. For example, in the United States where I live, the issue of a wall with Canada to exclude white Canadians is not the issue of concern in a risingly in a xenophobic context. It's about brown people from the global south crossing the border. And that's woven into the discourse. So we try very intentionally to call that out and to make it clear how the issue is raised. And then I think once people are in a context of migration status, we also try to both lift up and support the agency of women of color migrant leaders, and also to point out the double levels of exclusion. For example, and Mon Ami, you could speak to this, but Mon Ami was with an organization in Queens, in New York, of South Asian folk who were doubly experiencing exclusion as Muslims and South Asians, who joined a coalition in New York taking on police racial profiling because as migrants and people of color and Muslims, they were being directly targeted by that. So they became deeply involved in changing policy in New York City around racial profiling. And so we're trying to consistently support groups that are taking on the places where race and migration come together.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add to that, if it's okay, Karen.
Yep, go for it.
It's a really important question because in the global level, as Leah mentioned, it's such a different set of actors. And I'll be very frank, in Geneva, New York, and UN circles, race is not mentioned. But what is clear, and coming after the Global Forum on Migration Development in Berlin, is that racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, in addition to what is talked about in terms of Islamophobia, are really driving this compact in Europe. There is a particular way in which Black migrants, African migrants, are being labeled as the bad migrants, the economic migrants, and within that, Black women particularly, and are being criminalized in forms like racial profiling that have to do with migration, as Carol mentioned, that are not being discussed in the compact, and we're really trying to inject that conversation. They don't want us to use the term racism, but only to talk about xenophobia, and there's a big pushback by a lot of migrant organizations on that front as well. And then lastly, to say to really try to flip the script and raise the leadership of women of color, migrant women particularly, and women of the Global South as organizers in this process.
Great. Another question that's just come in, from your experience, how do we as civil society ensure that issues of racism be represented? And she's asking this question within the Canadian context.
Just to echo Mon Ami, I'd say that it has to do with making sure that there is leadership of women of color and migrant women in articulating how.
And in addition to that, I would say what's happening now is the UN has a campaign called UN Together, which is to address xenophobia. You can look up the website. It's a very high-profile social media campaign, but it's also, frankly, many folks find it lacking in substance and in some ways quite tokenizing. What we're trying to advocate for many fronts is to say that the issues of racism and xenophobia within the Compact on Migration or in general need to be addressed with accountability, international standards, including tying it to CERD, the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. That you can't talk about xenophobia in the Compact without looking at international law that exists and campaigns that exist to address racial discrimination and racism in a structural, institutional way and hold private and public actors accountable. So there's really an effort to make sure that language is in the Compact, and that would mean really educating government representatives there and holding them to account to their obligations under CERD.
It's interesting, Mon Ami, that you mentioned CERD as well, because Canada is up for review with CERD right now, and there are a few groups in Canada that have put together shadow reports for the convention on the elimination of racial discrimination. So as Canadian groups, that's something else that we might want to look at, what civil society is saying there. Okay, so we are now at 20 after 10, and we've kept you all on much later than we had anticipated. There are some comments here, Mon Ami, for your reference, some interest in potentially finding out more about national and regional consultations. So just so folks are aware, I will communicate with you all afterwards and make sure that, that you can get in touch with Mon Ami, with Carol, and with Leah as well, if they can offer any support in terms of giving advice on how we, as Canadian groups, might engage the process further. So with that, I will thank very much Carol, Leah, and Mon Ami for your time. Leah, especially to you for the late time zone, and Mon Ami for connecting in the midst of other many meetings that you're attending at the moment. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you all. Thanks for your interest.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everybody. Okay, bye for now.